Greetings. In this video, I will talk about the naval battle between the Japanese and Russian fleets near Tsushima Island, which took place during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The main cause of the war was Russia's excessive ambitions, which had launched a program to develop the Far East and create what was called Yellow Russia, a territory dependent on the Russian Empire, encompassing parts of northern China, known as Manchuria, the Kwantung Peninsula, and potentially Korea. By the beginning of the 20th century, Russia had already achieved significant progress in carrying out this program. Since the late 19th century, under an agreement with China, the Chinese Eastern Railway had been under construction, running from Chita to Vladivostok, not through Russian territory, but via Manchuria, thus significantly shortening the Trans-Siberian Railway. In addition to building the railway, Russian companies began to actively colonize Manchuria. The de facto capital of Yellow Russia became the city of Harbin, a Russian-influenced city where Russian citizens were continually arriving. The second major step was the lease of the Kwantung Peninsula along with the port city of Port Arthur. In 1898, the Russian Empire signed a 25-year lease agreement for Kwantung with China. Port Arthur was intended to become the primary base of the Russian Pacific Fleet, replacing Vladivostok. This decision offered many advantages for Russia. First, unlike Vladivostok, Port Arthur was an ice-free port. Second, it was strategically located in the epicenter of events and could cover the coast of Manchuria from enemy fleets, while Vladivostok was situated further away. The Russian authorities acted with unprecedented boldness, and after completing the Chinese Eastern Railway, they immediately began construction of the so-called South Manchurian Railway, which connected Harbin with Port Arthur. Russia's economic activity in the region continued to grow, to the point where a Russian company, backed by senior Russian officials, obtained timber concessions in the northern part of Korea from the Korean government. These actions raised concerns in Japan, whose leadership was not willing to accept the role of a secondary power. However, the Russian government was not afraid of war with the monkeys, as they unofficially referred to the Japanese. On the contrary, the more extreme part of the Russian officials even welcomed the possibility of a short, victorious war with a small Japan compared to Russia. However, the Russian leadership failed to take into account that their aggressive policies had provoked serious dissatisfaction among the governments of the British Empire and the United States, which provided massive financial and military assistance to Japan, enabling its army to effectively counter the aggressive plans of the Russian Empire. Japan itself also carefully prepared for the inevitable war. Thus, on January 27th, February 9th, in the new style, 1904, the Japanese army attacked Russia, starting the Russo-Japanese War. The combat operations were set to take place both on land and at sea between the Russian Pacific Fleet and the Japanese fleet. The Russian Pacific Fleet was tasked with preventing a Japanese landing in Manchuria and stopping the supply of weapons and ammunition to the Japanese army. Was this mission impossible? Let's analyze the combat composition of the fleets. The main combat force of the fleet at the beginning of the 20th century consisted of battleships, typically armed with 4 12-inch 305mm main guns, placed in 2 turrets at the bow and stern. In addition, the standard configuration included several fast 152 mm guns and usually smaller caliber anti-mine artillery. The 1st Pacific Squadron, based in Port Arthur, had 7 battleships of various types. Among them were the newest battleships, Retvizan, built in 1901 in the USA, and Cesarevich, built in 1903 in France. I have provided pictures of these beauties. You can admire them. 3 ships, Petropavlovsk, Sevastopol, and Poltava, were part of the Poltava-class battleships built in Russia in 1894 to 1895. According to contemporary skeptics, the verdict "built in Russia" meant expensive, poor quality, and unreliable, and this project was criticized by many. However, I must note that these battleships represented formidable combat power and were, in fact, only inferior to the first 2 ships in speed. Cesarevich, 18.8 knots, Retvizan, 18 knots, Poltava, 16.5 knots. To clarify, a knot is the speed at which a ship travels 1 nautical mile, 1,852 meters, per hour. Multiply this figure by 18 or 16.5, and you'll get the speed of these ships. Finally, 2 battleships, Peresvet and Pobeda, were part of the Peresvet-class battleships built in the early 20th century. In my opinion, the design was not the most successful, as it tried to combine 2 somewhat different missions. These ships were intended for cruiser raids, so their speed was relatively high, 18.6 knots, and their guns were somewhat lighter, 254 millimeters. As a result, they ended up being neither one thing nor the other. Too large and heavy for cruiser work, but not fully suited for squadron battles due to their slightly smaller caliber guns. Despite this contradiction, the Perevet-class battleships were powerful and capable warships. The Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet included 6 battleships, which I will discuss later. I will just note that the Japanese fleet significantly outnumbered the Russian fleet in terms of battleship cruisers armed with 8-inch, 203mm guns. However, the decisive factor in the fleet-to-fleet combat was the largest caliber guns, where the fleets were effectively on par. In other words, the tasks set for the Russian fleet in the Pacific were quite achievable. But things did not unfold as expected. As I mentioned, the war began with the Japanese squadron's attack on Port Arthur on the night of January 26th to 27th, 1904, old style. During this attack, the 2 best battleships of the Russian fleet, Retvizan and Cesarevich, were seriously damaged by torpedo strikes, and their repair took several months. The cruiser Pavlida was also damaged, but this was not significant. Although the Russian squadron still had considerable strength at its disposal, its commanders, overstating the superiority of the Japanese fleet, practically abandoned active naval operations. Moreover, on May 31st, 1904, the flagship of the Russian fleet, Petropavlovsk, struck a mine and sank almost immediately. In this catastrophe, the commander of the Pacific Squadron, Admiral Stepan Makarov, was killed. He is considered by many to be the best admiral of the Russian Navy during this war. Honestly, I disagree with this view and believe that Makarov himself was at fault for the disaster. Before this, he had repeatedly taken the squadron to sea along the same route without attempting to change it. One doesn't have to be a genius to guess that mines might be placed on this route, and the Japanese did not hesitate to do so. It was necessary to fundamentally improve the situation, and the Russian leadership decided to form the 2nd Pacific Squadron from the ships of the Baltic Fleet and send it to Port Arthur to assist the 1st Squadron. However, since the construction and outfitting of the latest battleships were not expected to be completed until September. The squadron's departure was postponed to that time. So, what was the composition of the 2nd Pacific Squadron? Its main combat strength consisted of 4 modern battleships of the Borodino class, which were a creative evolution of the Cesarewitch battleship design. These were the Borodino itself, along with the battleships Alexander III, Knyaz Suvorov, and Orel. Each was equipped with 4 long-range 305 mm guns, well-thought-out armor protection, and a speed of 18 knots. The second group of battleships included the Oslabya, Sysoy, Veliki, and Navarin, which were significantly less effective. The Oslabya, the third ship of the Persvet class, was a new vessel, but as I've noted, it was unclear whether it was a battleship or an armored cruiser, as its maximum caliber was 254 millimeters, making it hard to classify as a full-fledged battleship. While Sysoy Veliki was considered a proper battleship, it was outdated and had notable design flaws. The Navarin, the first Russian battleship of its era, also mounted 305 millimeter guns, but they lacked long-range capabilities. Moreover, these ships could only reach speeds of up to 16 knots, which significantly reduced the overall speed of the squadron, as the speed of a fleet is determined by its slowest ship. In addition, the squadron included other types of vessels: cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary ships. Among the cruisers, there were armored ones armed with powerful 203 millimeter guns, protected cruisers equipped with quick-firing 152 millimeter guns, and light cruisers with smaller caliber artillery. As you can imagine, the speed of most cruisers exceeded that of the battleships. The cruisers were of mixed types, ranging from the newest to very outdated models. There was also a significant shortage of armored cruisers, which could have been very helpful in supporting the battleships during fleet engagements. Finally, there were destroyers, ships designed to launch torpedo attacks against enemy vessels. Among these, 2 classes stood out: so-called fleet destroyers, or destroyers armed with several large-caliber torpedo tubes and 75 millimeter and 47 millimeter guns, and smaller numbered torpedo boats with much lower displacement, armed with 1 or 2 torpedo tubes and a 47 millimeter gun. Ships of the latter type were not taken on the long voyage. Vice Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, the chief of the main naval staff, was appointed as the squadron's commander. At the end of September, the squadron relocated to Libava, modern-day Liepāja, and finally, on October 2nd, 1904, it set off on its long journey. Due to the fact that the new battleships had a draft that prevented them from passing through the Suez Canal, they were sent around Africa. Other ships traveled via the Mediterranean, with the intention of reuniting the 2 groups of the squadron near Madagascar. The voyage was not without incident. On the night of October 22nd, 1904, near Dogger Bank in the North Sea, not far from the English city of Hull, the Russian fleet mistakenly fired upon British fishing vessels, having taken them for Japanese ships. This event became known as the Dogger Bank Incident. The journey was accompanied by an atmosphere of hysteria, with rumors spreading that Japan had sent submarines or destroyers to intercept the Russian fleet. It is therefore unsurprising that, amidst the confusion, the 2nd Squadron's ships opened fire on fishermen. This event, to put it mildly, did not foster friendly relations between the Russian and British empires, but rather brought them to the brink of war. Finally, on December 27, 1904, both detachments of the Pacific Squadron reached Madagascar and anchored in the Bay of Nosy-Be, where the French government had permitted the Russian fleet to dock. The squadron remained there until March 3rd, 1905. This prolonged stay was due to significant changes in the course of the war. On December 20th, the garrison at Port Arthur capitulated. The 1st Pacific Squadron was destroyed, with only a few ships managing to escape to neutral ports, where they were disarmed and effectively lost for further military use. Now, the 2nd Pacific Squadron had to achieve naval dominance in the Yellow Sea and turn the tide in Russia's favor. This task was impossible. It is hard to comprehend how a fleet without a naval base could succeed in this mission when the fleet with a base at Port Arthur had failed to do so. To reinforce the fleet for this new mission, the 3rd Pacific Squadron, under Rear Admiral Nikolai Nebogatov, was sent. However, this squadron was composed of anything that could stay afloat, and its composition was far from impressive. The battleship group of this squadron consisted of the battleship Imperator Nikolai I and 3 coastal defense battleships, Admiral Sineavin, Admiral Ushakov, and Admiral Apraxin. The flagship Imperator Nikolai I, built in 1888, was already outdated during the rapid development of battleship technology. It was armed with 2 305mm guns of the 1877 model, which had low penetration power and a rate of fire of 1 round every 2 minutes. The coastal defense battleships, built in 1894, each had 4 254mm guns. However, they were designed for coastal operations, not long voyages, and as a result, their seaworthiness was poor, and their displacement was 3 times smaller than that of the Borodino-class battleships. The squadron also included the armored cruiser Vladimir Molomek, built in 1882, armed with 5 152mm guns. Every aspect of its design was outdated. A glance at its appearance reveals that by 1904 it was a clear anachronism. Rozhestvensky decided not to wait for Nebogatov at Madagascar, and on March 3, 1905, the squadron departed, crossing the Indian Ocean and reaching the Von Phong Bay in Indochina. On April 26th, Nebogatov's squadron also arrived there. What to do next? Rozhestvensky understood that achieving naval dominance was unfeasible and set the fleet's primary goal as breaking through to Vladivostok. There were 3 potential routes to Vladivostok. The first was through the Tsugaru Strait between Honshu and Hokkaido. However, Rozhestvensky believed this strait might be mined. The second was around Japan and through the La Perouse Strait between Hokkaido and Sakhalin. This route, however, was too long, and the squadron lacked the coal reserves for it. Rozhestvensky chose the third option, through the Korea Strait, the widest of the 3 and the shortest route. However, this path was also the most advantageous for the Japanese, as their naval bases were nearby. On May 1st, 1905, the Russian squadron embarked on its final voyage. On the night of May 14th, it entered the Korea Strait and approached the island of Tsushima, located within the strait. Now it is time to describe the Japanese squadron. Its main combat strength consisted of a battleship division of 4 ships: Mikasa, Shikishima, Asahi, and Fuji. All 4 were built in Britain, and each was armed with 4 305mm guns. Their speed ranged from 18 to 18.7 knots. Japanese battleships boasted higher rates of fire and better-designed armor protection. A formidable component was their 8 armored cruisers, where the Japanese fleet had a significant advantage over the Russian squadron. Among them were two cruisers built in Italy, Nishin and Kasuga, each armed with two 203mm guns, with Kasuga also having one 254mm gun. These ships were initially sought by Russia, but according to rumors, Russian officials hinted at the need for bribes. Frustrated, the Italians sold the cruisers to Japan, whose representatives made the payment almost immediately. 4 of the other 6 armored cruisers were built in Britain, with one each constructed in France and Germany. Despite their diverse origins, these cruisers were of a unified type, each armed with 4 203mm guns. The Japanese significantly outnumbered the Russians in destroyers. Against the 9 Russian destroyers, the Japanese deployed 30 destroyers and 33 numbered torpedo boats. However, it is clear that torpedo boats were not the primary weapon of victory in the battle. Overall, the forces were relatively equal. The Japanese had an advantage in armored cruisers, speed, and smaller vessels. Still, their advantage was not so overwhelming as to guarantee a decisive victory over the Russian squadron automatically. The combined fleet of the Japanese Empire was commanded by Admiral Heihachiro Togo. The battle itself took place on May 14th to 15th, 1905, May 27th to 28th in the new style. The Russians spotted the Japanese fleet at 1:30 p.m. At the beginning of the engagement, Admiral Togo made a mistake that could have been disastrous. He began turning his fleet to parallel the Russian column, performing this maneuver in close proximity to the Russian ships. The Russian flagship battleship Knyaz Suvorov opened fire. However, Rozhdestvensky failed to capitalize on this opportunity and did not turn his column to engage. As a result, only the leading ships in the Russian column could fire on the Japanese. Once the risky maneuver was complete, the Japanese squadron began full combat. Using their superior speed, the Japanese outpaced the Russian squadron and encircled its lead. They concentrated fire on the flagship battleship Knyaz Suvorov and the flagship of the 2nd Battleship Detachment, Oslabya. At 2:25 p.m., Oslabya was put out of action and sank 25 minutes later. By 2:40 p.m., the flagship was disabled and Admiral Rozhdestvensky was wounded. The flagship's masts and yardarms were destroyed, and all signal halyards burned, making it impossible to issue a signal transferring command. The Russian squadron was effectively leaderless. At 4:20 p.m., a thick fog descended, halting the battle, which resumed nearly 2 hours later. In the evening engagement, 3 of Russia's best battleships were lost. The Japanese sank the battleships Alexander III and Borodino and finished off the already defenseless Suvorov. Night fell, during which the Japanese destroyers launched attacks on the Russian squadron from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. These attacks resulted in the loss of the battleship Admiral Nakhimov, while Navarin and Sysoy Veliky were also sunk by torpedoes. During the night, the Russian ships lost contact with one another and continued their journey individually. Only Rear Admiral Nebogatov's detachment remained cohesive, accompanied by the sole surviving modern battleship Oral and the cruiser Izumrud. However, on the morning of May 15th, around 10 a.m., this group was surrounded by the entire Japanese fleet. Without engaging in battle, Nebogatov surrendered. Only the cruiser Izumrud refused the order to surrender. It accelerated to full speed, broke through the Japanese encirclement, and headed for Vladivostok. On the way, it entered Vladimir Bay, where it ran aground and was subsequently destroyed on the orders of its commander. The last battleship of Nebogatov's squadron, Admiral Ushakov, having fallen behind the main group, was scuttled by its crew. To make matters worse, At 4 p.m., the Japanese captured the destroyer Bedovi, which carried the wounded Admiral Rozhestvensky and his staff. Thus, the commander of the 2nd Pacific Squadron was taken prisoner. A cruiser detachment consisting of Oleg, Aurora, and Jemchug turned south on the night of May 14th to 15th. Upon arriving in Manila in the Philippines, the cruisers were interned. Only the second-rank cruiser Almaz and 2 destroyers, Grozny and Bravi, successfully reached Vladivostok. This was all that remained of the 2nd Pacific Squadron. Of the 38 Russian ships, 21 were sunk or scuttled by their crews, 7 battleships, 6 cruisers, 5 destroyers, and 3 auxiliary vessels. 7 were captured or surrendered, 4 battleships, 1 destroyer, and 2 hospital ships. 6 were interned in foreign ports, 3 cruisers, 1 destroyer, and 2 auxiliaries, and only 4, a cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 1 auxiliary, reached Vladivostok. The Japanese fleet, by contrast, lost only 2 numbered torpedo boats, with a third lost in a collision with another vessel. Russia's defeat was total, crushing, and humiliating. What were the reasons for such a devastating defeat? Many causes have been suggested, but 2 major issues stand out as particularly significant. The first was a critical error in the choice of shell type for the main artillery caliber. Most shells in the Russian fleet were armor-piercing, with very few high-explosive shells. Armor-piercing shells were designed to penetrate enemy armor and detonate afterward, causing damage behind the armor. However, this meant that at long ranges, the shell's kinetic energy was reduced, and Russian ships could only fire effectively at close range, up to 20 cables. 1 cable equals 1/10 of a nautical mile, or 185.2 meters. In contrast, the Japanese used high explosive shells filled with a substance called shiemos, a type of melanite. These shells were designed to penetrate enemy armor through powerful explosions. Such shells could be fired from maximum range because, even at the end of their trajectory, they exploded just as effectively as when fired from close distances. The explosions of Russian shells were almost imperceptible, whereas the explosions of Japanese shells were massive and visible from afar. A 305-millimeter Russian shell contained 15 pounds of pyroxylin, while its Japanese counterpart carried 105 pounds of shimos. The different purposes of these shells resulted in vastly different behavior. Russian shells only detonated upon hitting armor and failed to explode when striking unarmored surfaces. Japanese shells, however, detonated even upon hitting water. This allowed Japanese sailors to effectively adjust their artillery fire, while Russian gunners could not do the same. The issue was further compounded by the fact that Russian shells were deliberately lightened to improve accuracy, making them even less suitable for long-range firing. Another key reason for the defeat was the inadequate training of Russian ship crews and the unpreparedness and lack of initiative among naval commanders. Rozhestvensky's squadron sailed for several months and had long stops along the way. Why were these not used for training exercises and gunnery practice? It's a rhetorical question. Some conspiracy theories have suggested that the Russian squadron was lost due to treachery within the fleet's leadership. In my view, this belongs to the realm of fantasy. And with that, I conclude my story. Goodbye,